Mark Thompson is the president and CEO of the New York Times Company, and it's as I mentioned before, this is we just missed having a very interesting sort of event in which we had the CEO of News Corp and the CEO of the New York Times speaking together. But it's just about the same, just one before lunch and one after lunch. And this is an important event just because it shows that this is not really a political issue. This is an issue about structures that affect journalism, affects the people's ability to report the news, to pay for the reporting of the news, to edit the news, to pay for editing of the news, and to publish the news, and to pay for publishing of the news. I worked for a long time as a magazine editor. I ran a magazine called Global Business for 7 years. It was an advertising-supported magazine. There's a lot of people out there nowadays who demean the role of the publisher. They say publishers are not necessary. They say this about publishers in the book business, and they say this about publishers in the news industry. Publishers make it possible to put news in front of the reader, in front of the citizen. If publishers can't pay for the news, we do not have news. Publishers are the business operation behind the reporter, behind the editor. So for us, it's a really great honor to have Mark Thompson here today. Mark Thompson has led the strategic operations and business units of the New York Times since November 2012. He worked closely with the chairman to direct the vision of the company since then. He has been instrumental in accelerating the pace of the Times' digital transformation, and under his leadership, the Times has also introduced a new era of international growth, launched an industry-leading branded content studio, and invested in virtual reality, producing some of the most celebrated work in the emerging medium. Previously, Mr. Thompson served as Director General of the BBC from 2004, where he reshaped the organization to meet the challenge of the digital age, ensuring that it remained a leading innovator with the launch of services such as the BBC iPlayer. Just a couple of things before I turn it over to Mark, who's going to speak, and then also to Rana, who's going to speak with Mark when he's done. Recently, Dean Baquet, the editor of the New York Times, made one of the most important comments that I've seen about the state of journalism in the United States, and he said that, when I wake up in the morning, and I'm paraphrasing here, when I wake up in the morning, I'm very concerned about the fact that, what's happening in the White House, but what keeps me awake at night is the collapse of local journalism in the United States because of what that means for our ability to preserve democracy. That's the editor that works for Mark Thompson. It is a great pleasure to have the New York Times with us today.
Thank you. Too many Thompsons today. Sorry about that. You can distinguish me from Robert. I have a P in the middle of my Thompson. I come from the aristocratic branch of the family. These are troubling days for journalism. Even the primacy of fact and well-sourced objective reporting over delusion and propaganda is under assault. A concert party of Russia and other repressive regimes, populists and extremists, assorted trolls and bots, not to mention the 45th President of the United States, are doing their best to convince the world of what George Orwell in 1984 called black-white. In other words, that dispassionate, accurate journalism is fake news and conspiracy theories, gross exaggeration and outright lies are the real thing. Their aim is to level reality with their own alternative facts, and by this process of leveling, to rob serious journalism of its civic impact and value. Now, they don't have to be believed to succeed. They merely need to sow enough doubt in enough minds that a large slice of the population no longer knows who to trust. Some of the conventions which protect the ability of real journalists to report real news are also being flouted. Last week, we learnt that as part of a leak inquiry, the FBI had seized years' worth of emails and phone records belonging to New York Times reporter Ali Watkins. That may be standard operating procedure in controlled societies. In this country, it breaches established precedent, it manifestly is against the spirit of the First Amendment, and it's been rightly condemned by the Committee to Protect Journalists as what they called a fundamental threat to press freedom. But these threats can be seen off. The fake newsers may have convinced some people that up is down for now, but sooner or later, brute reality and common sense will settle the argument in favour of the facts. And as for state and press freedom, the safeguard enshrined in the Bill of Rights and the tradition of self-restraint by the authorities when free speech is at stake should prevail, at least if citizens speak out and Congress and the courts do their jobs. But the most serious threat facing journalism, the disruption of the traditional business model for journalism, and the failure of all but a handful of titles across the Western world to find credible digital alternatives, is much more intractable. It presents as an economic problem, but its consequences, which as you've heard are already playing out, and unless something changes, are likely to grow far worse over the coming years, its consequences are civic and political. Democracies cannot remain healthy if citizens do not know what is happening in their communities, if public and private institutions are not held to account, if elections come and go without issues being aired and candidates being scrutinised. Unfortunately, at present, the local, regional and national professional journalism, which historically played such an important role in meeting these civic needs, is ailing, in some cities and regions dying in much of America and the West. There are exceptions, and the New York Times is one of them. We have national scale and international potential, as you heard. We realized in time that high-quality journalism, a deep relationship with our most engaged readers, and an effective digital subscription model offered a far more promising path to the future than digital advertising alone. Today, we have more digital news subscribers than any other news organization in the world, and at getting on for 4 million, twice as many total subscriber relationships as at the very peak of print 25 years ago. Our revenue and operating profits have been growing, not failing, whatever a little bird might have told you. But most importantly, we have a newsroom and editorial department which at some 1,450 strong are bigger and more formidable than they were 10 or 20 years ago. And for me, that's less the result of our digital success than the single most important reason for that success. The Times responded to digital disruption not by disinvesting in high-quality news and opinion, but by doubling down on them. And as we found, whatever the cultural pessimists may say, a growing number of people here and around the world are willing to pay for it. But we have advantages that most news providers do not enjoy. And even with these advantages, we find the environment for growing our digital revenue and securing the funding of our newsroom harder than I believe we should. So, to today's conference, to what extent are the major digital platforms, Google, Facebook, Apple, and the others, part of the problem? And if they are, what could they, we, and the world's policymakers and regulators do to put things right? Two caveats first. One, there's no point blaming individual digital companies, no matter how big, for the fundamental attributes of the internet or for the decline and fall of the cozy print advertising-based business model that supported journalism for so long. Neither are their fault, and in any event, there's no way of putting the clock back. Two, I want to proceed with a presumption of good faith on the part of the major platforms. Like many media executives, I've spent time with the leaders of Google, Facebook, and Apple, and others, and I've seen no evidence that they want to destroy journalism or are unaware of the crisis in the economics of news, or indeed unwilling to explore ways of improving the ecosystem. Google, in particular, as Robert said before lunch, has taken a series of tangible steps to help news organizations build digital subscriptions, for instance, allowing publishers to deploy their subscription rules in the Google platform rather than imposing Google's own rules on them. Facebook has to date been much less responsive, focusing largely on its own ideas rather than developing solutions jointly with publishers. Here too, though, there has at least been a willingness to listen. However, and as you've already heard this morning, major unresolved issues still remain. And let me frame them in my way, though these themes have come up before. I think we can put these issues under 4 broad headings. Opacity. We do not know, beyond inevitably imperfect and incomplete empirical observation, how the algorithms of the major platforms sort and prioritize our content, nor can we reliably predict or influence changes in those algorithms, nor in any sense hold the companies to account for those changes. Impoverishment of the news experience. To appreciate and critique news sources over time and to decide which to trust, users need to develop sophisticated relationships with news brands and individual reporters and opinion writers. But the platforms encourage atomized consumption of single stories and the jumbling of stories of different depth and quality from different sources, and they strip away essential signals, news or opinion, for instance, lead story or minor footnote about editorial intentionality. Inequitable economics. Although the platforms undoubtedly help publishers reach new audiences, most publishers believe that the current division of the economic benefit of the presence of news content on the platforms unfairly favors the platforms. And finally, independence and plurality of editorial decision-making. This is the least discussed issue. It is that open societies require multiple independent points of editorial control which can compete and hold each other to account, and between which the public can choose, but that the major platforms may decide or feel pressured to replace this plurality with single points of essentially algorithmic editorial control. These 4 categories are not mutually exclusive, but rather mutually reinforcing. The relative poverty of the news experience on the platforms makes it harder for publishers to monetize it. The opacity of the operation of the search and social algorithms increases the risk of a loss of plurality in editorial decision-making. And of course, business model failure because of the inferior economics of the platforms will have its own impact on plurality. Most people assume that publishers really only care about the disappointing revenue they derive from their presence on the platforms. But my view is that all 4 headings are important, and not just to publishers, but to society at large. So let me offer a few responses to these concerns. First, full transparency about both algorithmic and human editorial selection by the major digital platforms is an essential preliminary if we're to address any of these issues. It would be best if this was done voluntarily, but even if it requires regulation or legislation, it must be done and done promptly. As a second preliminary, the major platforms must engage with the collective industry bodies of the news business to arrive at shared principles, both on the presentation and choice of news content and on its monetization. The stakes and the need for consistency and comparability in the treatment of news providers mean that though the present informal bilateral relationships, say between the Times and Google or the Washington Post and Facebook, should no doubt continue, they're simply not enough. Third, we need to do more to restore the labels and design cues that help users make sense of news in a physical newspaper or on a TV screen or even on a traditional web page, but which are stripped out in smartphone news feeds and search results. Without sufficient signposts, no wonder users confuse news and opinion and other significant editorial nuances. Fourth, regulators, both here, in Europe, and in other jurisdictions, should examine how well these markets are functioning. In economic terms, news provision on the major platforms consists of 2 barters. Consumers exchange their attention and personal data for the services provided by the platform, while publishers offer the platforms valuable content in exchange for distribution, audience leads, and advertising opportunities. It's sometimes argued that because the major platforms do not charge consumers money for their services, the public cannot suffer exploitative pricing. But barter implies an exchange of goods or services of real and quantifiable value in which a party can get a better or worse deal. If scale and network effects allow a search or social platform to achieve market dominance, a consumer who feels that they must use that platform may find themselves exchanging their attention and data for less in return by way of services than they would if there was effective competition. The same goes for a publisher who may conclude they have no choice but to offer their content to a platform despite the poor economics. In other words, a market based on barter can experience market dominance, market failure, and market abuse. I don't want to jump to the conclusion that such abuse is occurring, but these markets deserve close technical scrutiny and may require competition remedies. Lastly, the topic of independence and plurality of editorial decision-making. We face an immediate threat here, which is that Facebook's catalogue of missteps with data and extreme and hateful content will lead it into a naive attempt to set itself up as the digital world's editor-in-chief, prioritizing and presumably downgrading and rejecting content on a survey and data-driven assessment of whether the provider of the content is, quotes, broadly trusted or not. Now, you might expect the New York Times to favor such a scheme. Indeed, Mark Zuckerberg, whose idea this seems to be, told us that the Times should expect to do very well in such a ranking. In fact, we regard the concept of, quotes, broadly trusted as a sinister one, which misunderstands the role journalism plays in an open society and is likely to lead to damage and distort not just the news business, but democratic debate. Democracy depends in part on unbounded competition between different journalistic perspectives and the clash of different judgments and opinions. History suggests that mainstream news organizations frequently get it right, but also that not infrequently it is the outliers who should be listened to. At any given moment, think of mainstream media today in Russia or in continental Europe in the 20s or 30s, at any given moment a majority of the public may judge trustworthiness incorrectly. To feed transient majority sentiment about trust back into the editorial decision-making process and to do it essentially behind closed doors is profoundly dangerous. The process of citizens making up their own mind which news source to believe is messy and can indeed lead to fake news being believed, but to rob citizens of that ability and to replace the straightforward accountability of editors and publishers for the news they produce with a centralized trust algorithm will not make democracy healthier, but damage it further. The sheer depth of Facebook's lack of understanding of the nature and civic purpose of news was recently revealed by their proposal, somewhat modified after representations from the news industry, to categorize and label journalism used for marketing purposes by publishers as political advocacy, given that both contain political content. This is like arguing that an article about pornography in the New York Times is exactly the same as pornography. Facebook admitted to us that their practical problem was that they were under intense public pressure to label political advocacy, but their algorithm was unable to tell the difference between advocacy and journalism. That will be the same algorithm which will soon be given the task of telling the world which news to trust. When it comes to news, Facebook still doesn't get it. In its efforts to clear up one bad mess, it seems set on joining those who want to blur the line between reality-based journalism and propaganda. But the underlying danger of the agency of editors and the public alike being usurped by centralized algorithms and algorithmic control is present with every digital platform where we do not fully understand how the processes of editorial selection and prioritization take place, which right now means all of them, thus the urgent need for transparency. The internet could still fulfill its promise as the enabler of a more informed, more empowered democracy, but it won't get there on its own, and nor will the major digital platforms. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. You covered a lot of ground and really, really interesting stuff there. Let me start. We've got about 15 minutes. Let me start. You laid out sort of two big issues with tech platforms and how it relates to journalism. The problem of fake news and the real sort of institutional trust issues, issues for belief in democracy, but also the competitiveness issue for journalism, but also just monopoly power in general and what that means. Do you think it's enough? I mean, one of the big debates this morning has been, to what extent can the business model of these companies really be tweaked voluntarily? To what extent can there be these shared principles that you're talking about, these discussions that are being had to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the kind of company that you're talking about? And to what extent do we really need to look at regulatory frameworks and say maybe repeal the loopholes through Section 230 that these companies enjoy? To what extent is this really going to take real government action?
Well, we're conducting an experiment in real time to figure that out. I mean, that's what's happening right now. Is we're seeing what the boundaries of pretty urgent industry conversations with the platforms. I want to say essentially what Robert said before lunch, which is Google has been significantly more responsive in recent months and years to publishers, and although I think there's a lot more to come, and needs to be a lot more to come, there's some cause for optimism about, as it were, non-regulatory solutions. Facebook, much less so. Very affable conversations, but much less so. And I want to say, I'm afraid that because this goes to, in my head, so much to democracy and to the fundamental rights of the public. I mean, in some ways, publishers, we're business people, we'll kind of figure it out as best we can. But the public's right to get exposure to information in a way which they can make sense of and can vote accordingly. That's so important to me that some level of guarantee, which in the end I think means law and regulation, I think is going to be essential. I do.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's. Oh, sorry. Am I not on? Am I good? Oh, hold it up. Hello. Testing. To what extent do you think that Europe is taking the lead in terms of where we may be going?
Well, let's see what happens. I think that I mean, manifestly, the competition authorities, the Commission and DG10 and so on, have been more active than in the US in terms of holding the major platforms to account, and there have been various remedies, relatively small and I would say tactical remedies in place. There's clearly now a head of steam building. I was in the Commission a few weeks ago, both in the European Parliament and the Commission, for more action. Let's see what that consists of. Although the European process tends to be a complicated and very frustrating one for almost everyone involved, the possibility of action, I think, is there, and it's likely, I guess, that we'll see action there. The UK government, I would say, is also now considering legislation as well, and the UK, where in some ways some of the best technical expertise is in the UK, might also be a bit of a thought leader here, kind of almost irrespective of the Brexit point.
Well, you're bringing up another interesting point, which is that there are a lot of different countries developing lots of different rules right now around many different aspects of this problem, from privacy to antitrust. Are you worried about a splinter net? Are you worried about regulatory arbitrage and what that might mean, not just for the news business, but business in general?
Look, I think the idea that because the internet is kind of global, that you can't protect your own democracy and the rights of your citizens had better be challenged, really. I mean, I think in the end, we do have a system of nations, and our democracies have powers and rights. And I think international companies, including the New York Times in this, had better understand that they're going to, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, they're going to have to as long as fundamental principles of freedom of speech and so on aren't threatened, they're going to have to kind of work with the principles of that jurisdiction. And I want to say that the topic we're talking about here, which is fundamentally about the ability of people at large to have access to news in a way which has not been filtered in some invisible and unaccountable way to who knows what end. I mean, we worry about the lack of freedom of speech in controlled societies. There are similar issues here, and one of the reasons I agree with Robert about much of what Robert says. I'm, however, not convinced that an algorithm review board, an ARB, is such a great plan. My assumption is that President Putin and President Xi Jinping already have such bodies, and they use them to censor those societies. And the idea of, people say, shouldn't Facebook become a publisher? It makes my blood run cold, the idea of Facebook as a publisher, actually. I'm not sure that's quite the solution either. But the idea, Facebook and Google, of transferring that kind of control to essentially to politicians or to the politicians' proxies. Now, one can imagine structures which might give some protection and accountability, but you can see the problem. And to me, it may not seem like an important point, I talked about the kind of the cues and the ways you give a user a chance to decide for themselves whether to trust something or not trust something. That's what's kind of got stripped out, and that's, I don't think censoring fake news is the right answer. I think giving people enough information to figure out for themselves on a bell curve majority basis what to believe or not to believe is what our tradition in Britain and America and other Western democracies of freedom of speech calls for.
No, it's a very good point. On that note, you have a good historical perspective pre and post 2016 and far before. Yeah. Talk us through a little bit about what's working for you all from a business model standpoint in terms of the move to digital. And, you had some pretty robust numbers there that you were sharing. What's the future?
Well, so if you've got, high quality content, the internet, it remains, having said everything we said, a pretty good environment to find the right audience for that content. And if you can find that audience, people are getting used to, partly because of Netflix and Spotify and so forth, the idea of paying for superior content. And therefore, a relationship which is both a relationship of trust in the content, but also a financial transaction becomes possible at scale across this great country and around the world. And we've seen our digital news model grow on that basis with, it must be said, a couple of kind of solid rocket boosters provided by the news cycle, and most notably the arrival of Mr. Trump in the White House.
Yeah, well, he's been good for everyone's subscriptions. That's true. On that note, how do you see subscription versus advertising playing out, that balance? And also, how does that relate to the larger issues of democracy? I mean, FT has a hard paywall. It works very well from a business model standpoint, but that's a very elite audience. How do you think about
Yeah, so we have, it's interesting, there are nuances here. We're a general interest news provider rather than a specialist provider, and our taste has been to have a very porous wall. We have about 140 million unique users a month, and we have just under sort of 4 million, probably about 3.7 million subscribers with the right to look at the content. So we have 136 million non-subscribers able to look at any given story, and they can sample the Times pretty extensively. Our rules are 5 stories a month, but that's essentially 5 stories per browser per device. So you can look very extensively at Times content. Our hope being that you draw more people in. And by the way, at the election, during kind of major natural disasters, we take the wall down entirely. So we've taken a view that we should still aim for a very broad audience, but we have a thesis in the jargon about a funnel where you have a lot of people coming in as light users, and you try and encourage them to become more engaged. And as they become more engaged, then you try and convert them into subscription. And that model works. Digital advertising, the ugly truth is like super simple. If you own 100 years ago, if you owned a printing press and you own trucks, you can say to Macy's, if you want to reach well-heeled New Yorkers for your sale, you better put an ad in the New York Times. And you get very powerful pricing power. Now, I want to say the platform, I mean, you know, if you think of the kind of the railway and the trains are now Facebook and Google, and publishers.
So natural monopolies.
Well, they are, you know, you can argue whether technically they're monopolies or not. Obviously, consumers have a choice, but they've got enormous market dominance. But the thing is, from being the kind of train owner, the publishers become, you know, the guy with the franchise to push the little trolley of drinks down. And the pricing power is much less. And I think the fundamental problem that digital advertising's had for publishers is they're not really platforms anymore.
You know, tell us, if you can, a little bit about the conversations you're having at this point with the tech platform firms. You alluded to the fact that they're very different depending on whether it's Facebook or Google.
Yeah.
How have those...
And by the way, Apple different again.
And Apple different.
Snap, and it's
Exactly. You know, what's the differentiation there, and what do you expect to happen in the next, say, year? And also, if the Democrats were to take Congress in the midterms, do you think that that would really change the picture here?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, just as a matter of practicality, we're not, we're going to run our business without waiting for the
Political
kind of
change.
regulatory and legislative cavalry to arrive at the crest of the hill. I think we'll be, Little Bighorn, I think we'll all be dead by the time they arrive. So we're going to run our business as best we can. I mean, God bless. Let's hope something happens. But the really big challenge, it seems to me, is that the engineers who've created this incredible companies, incredible success, have found it convenient, and also I think just psychologically, to think of news as if it's like bricks, and it's like lots of different brickworks, but it really doesn't, anyone can kind of assemble the bricks in any order. Consumers only want one brick at a time, and you can kind of, you can build anything with the bricks, and if you build it, it's yours, sort of thing. My view about news is it's a relationship, stories are not kind of individual point events. I mean, not such things exist, but generally they are long, unfolding themes in society. Gender in the workplace, the Trump presidency, they go on over time, and you get used to, in the relationship, understanding what's going on, and you get to know individual rights. You get to know you, what you stand for, what's surprising when you say it, when you've changed your mind, when you're back to one of your main themes. It's a relationship. And the truth is, the idea that news is just one more piece of content which can be sliced and diced, and it doesn't matter how and in what way and how it's presented, which is fundamentally the way that the internet's grown up, doesn't really work very well. And it confuses people and makes it hard for people to figure out what to believe and what not to believe. It's all a bit of a mess, really.
You all have done a
So
very...
that's the thing we're trying to convince them. Start thinking about how you aggregate something out of this. And I would say, broadly, I would say that there's, I don't want to say there's a complete understanding, but there's some recognition of that. I want to say at Google, we are really struggling with that thought in Facebook, who in a sense, they absolutely have an idea of a complete experience and a complete relationship. But that they see that as being Facebook's and Facebook's alone. That's
interesting. Let me ask you one final question, and then we're going to be out of time. You all have done actually a very good job in your own pages of looking at how the fake news problem is a global problem, and you know, with real life and death consequences in some countries. How do you see that playing out going forward? And are you having different discussions in different countries, in some of the developing countries you've covered, Burma, et cetera? Yeah, I mean, to me, the basic theme of a kind of a transitional period in human history where these new technologies, new forms of communication are kind of under-socialized, they're understood, they're under-regulated, and we're still digesting them. You know, in the 17th century, this was political pamphlets. People believed if it was a pamphlet, it must be true. 100 years later, they're kind of fish and chips in the pamphlet sort of thing. But initially, they have immense power on people, radio and fascism in the 1920s and 30s. And so I think part of what's happening is just an immensely difficult kind of transitional period where the media impact of the technology is playing out. But it manifested in many different contexts. People talk about different parts of the subcontinent, South Asia, as an example of that. It's having the effect of radicalizing, kind of accelerating divisions and polarization in ways which can lead to conflict. And I think, you know, this broader sense that we've all got to be quite careful
about what we say and how we report things because of the way things get so rapidly.
Yeah.
And the other last thing, the other very interesting point, which almost no one talks about, is reframing. And New York Times content, much of it is retweeted, but
Yes.
in a twisted
Yes,
frame. And I think
yes.
that business of the role of the kind of twister in taking the truth and twisting it and presenting it as if it was a lie, saying it's a lie, is another profoundly kind of new thought. It's very easy to do. Twitter in particular makes it possible to do that in fragments of a second.
Yeah, MIT study showing fake news is 70% more likely to be retweeted. All right, we could go on and on, but thank you so much. Great conversation, and keep fighting the good fight.